Well, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this Bruges Group online conference. We've got three very distinguished speakers here today. The first of which is Barney Reynolds, who is the global head of the financial services industry group at the multinational law firm of Shearman and Sterling. And he brings immense expertise to our discussion today. In July, he co-authored the Centre for Brexit Policy publication entitled Replacing the Withdrawal Agreement: How to Ensure that the UK Takes Back Control on Exiting the Transition. More recently, he has co-authored with others, including Professor David Collins of the City University of London, a publication entitled The EU Deal Unmasked: 12 Reasons Why the UK Will Fail to Get a Canada-Style Deal. Barney, welcome, and thank you for taking time out from your demanding schedule to contribute to our discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, Barney Reynolds.
Thank you. Thank you for having me at this event. I'm just going to talk briefly then about the sovereignty issues embedded in the arrangements currently in place for our leaving the EU, the Withdrawal Agreement and Northern Ireland Protocol, and the importance of resolving those as part of future arrangements that might be negotiated over the next days, weeks, I don't know how long. So I suppose the first point to note is that despite the fantastic coup in repositioning the Brexit negotiations at the end of last year, striking out the Northern Ireland backstop, we didn't have a full Brexit in January, and there are some encroachments on UK sovereignty that for the long term are unacceptable and need to be reversed or replaced. Ideally, by replacing withdrawal agreement and protocol entirely as part of the sovereignty compliant arrangements at year end. There is a legally and politically feasible way to achieve this. If the EU won't agree to that, it would be possible to denounce the withdrawal agreement and Northern Ireland Protocol in order to protect the UK's sovereign position and to gain the Brexit that those documents envisage the UK will achieve at year end. The main issue that everyone I'm sure is familiar with is the sort of poison pill in the Northern Ireland Protocol, which gives ongoing legal power to the EU over the Northern Ireland economy and through that over the UK economy. There are other aspects of UK sovereignty, however, that are encroached upon by the withdrawal agreement. And there are some options in the political declaration that sits alongside the withdrawal agreement in relation to security and defence interests that if the UK exercised them in the wrong way would involve participating in defence structures, which would again encroach on future sovereign choices. And then finally, the negotiations that are taking place at the moment themselves involve EU demands over UK sovereignty in respect to fishing waters and fishing rights and the so-called level playing field, which at least in the last public outing from the EU involved encroachments over UK laws and restrictions on choices in the UK as to all sorts of matters, including potentially tax. The Northern Ireland Protocol applies EU law to Northern Ireland for goods and agri-products under the oversight of the ECJ. So over time, if you go across the Irish Sea, you will feel you're in a slightly different country because you'll see different cars, washing machines, toys, and so on available in Northern Ireland. In addition, it applies EU state aid law, which is an area of law that gives dynamic oversight ability to the European Commission to anything which might look like an incentive in the UK as a whole outright in respect of anything in Northern Ireland itself, but for the rest of the UK in respect of anything which might be seen by the EU in its absolute discretion to affect trade across the north-south border on the island of Ireland. And that could, in principle, affect, a subsidy made to an electric car manufacturer in Sunderland, for instance, who has no intention of exporting across the north-south border on the island of Ireland, but that could have a theoretical effect on trade across that border, even if not in practice. And ECJ jurisprudence indicates that even a theoretical effect brings into play EU state aid law. The Northern Ireland Protocol also, as it stands, renders Northern Ireland business operations, including on the mainland in GB, completely unprotected from dumping and unfair subsidisation that takes place through the Eurozone architecture, which through, for instance, Target 2 mechanics involves unlimited vendor financing for Eurozone companies, and because of how the regulatory capital and the rules don't operate in accordance with Basel standards, it involves an artificially cheap banking system. The protocol also creates cumbersome mechanics for US customs across the RSC, east-west border, and imposes new checks on all agri-food imports into Northern Ireland and requires Northern Ireland to enforce EU VAT. So over time, Northern Ireland will become noticeably aligned with the single market, the EU single market, not the UK's internal market. Further threats to sovereignty in the document are ECJ oversight over ex-EU citizens' rights in the UK, which override Parliament for up to 100 years, till the last such citizen is no longer alive, and entrenches EU data protection laws. There's an unspecified divorce payment liability, and then large ongoing long-tail financial liabilities associated with our membership towards the EU, the EIB, and through participation in certain EU funds. In addition, there is an ongoing recognition of EU geographical indications of origin, which could undermine trade deals with others, and an encroachment on UK sovereignty with regard to the sovereign bases in Cyprus, as well as over Gibraltar. So how do we get into this pickle? Well, it was probably correct to sign the documentation in January in order to give 11 months more life to discussions to see if we could get to a sovereign compliant arrangement at year end. That's effectively what the price, the key thing that the UK got in that agreement, which is 11 months from the end of January to negotiate an agreement on the basis of the political declaration, which is a sort of heads of terms as to the future relationship between the UK and the EU. And in Article 4 of that heads of terms, it makes clear that any such arrangement must recognise UK sovereignty, which obviously is an indivisible concept, that we can't lock bits off it and still have sovereignty, and also the UK's internal market. Now, is it possible to sort out some of the issues that the withdrawal agreement and Northern Ireland Protocol seek to resolve in a sovereignty compliant manner? The answer is yes. You can either provide for an invisible border on the island of Ireland using alternative arrangements, and lots of very good people have spent time explaining how that can be done. Or alternatively, because the way that discussion has developed is that the alternative arrangements, which involve sort of numerous, about 20 or so different ways of doing things, one can point to little holes, theoretical holes between some of the different mechanics, and that's why it hasn't been agreed. The alternative way to do it is basically to have a UK guarantee, where the UK enforces the tariffs of the EU against exporters who are exporting across that border, and also EU standards again, to make sure that those exporters only export things that comply with EU standards, and the EU would do the same in reverse. And if things are found going across the border that don't comply, there would be a damages payment across the top, which would make the other party whole. And it's difficult to argue even if one picks away at the alternative arrangements concept, it's not possible to do that in relation to the mutual enforcement concept because it's an all-encompassing guarantee effectively. And it's mutual, which means that both parties have to live with it, which is one of the objections of the protocol system. You'd have national legislation on citizens' rights without treaty, the necessity for treaty arrangements. Level playing field obligations and objectives can be achieved through normal trade deal commitments and trade remedies. Fishing rights can be defined by normal sovereign independent coastal state rules and annual negotiations, and agreed outcomes can be policed through independent adjudication. The court remedies could transition back to the UK after a year rather than after several years from the ECJ under the current withdrawal agreement, with a sort of 1 year runoff for ECJ cases. The divorce payments could be capped. There could be a curtailment of long tail financial liabilities, and a recognition that the UK isn't required to cooperate with EU defence schemes and will only do so when it's the UK. And there would, of course, in an ideal world, if we're looking at a future relationship deal, be a services deal with financial services in the package. Not addressing these points now is somewhat dangerous because if these points are left in place, these sovereignty encroachments, then they could be accepted by conduct potentially after year end. So these are issues that do need sorting out. The way to forward, therefore, is to make clear that the bargain that the UK struck in January, which was that we'd have 11 months to talk about, which with an option to extend, which the UK has decided not to exercise, that we'd have 11 months to talk about a future sovereignty compliant relationship, must be upheld, and that the UK retains its sovereign right to withdraw from the EU exercised under those documents, under the varies of Article 50 of the treaty. And Article 50 didn't permit the EU to agree to anything more than effectively exit arrangements, and the future relationship, which was envisaged itself by Article 50, that the agreement in Article 50 is intrinsic to the whole thing. And if that doesn't transpire to reflect the reality, if it doesn't turn out to be fulfilled, then the whole thing falls away, and we have to unilaterally address the points that I've mentioned, which can be done. If the EU doesn't agree to replacements of all of these arrangements, then it will have been acting in breach of a material term of the withdrawal agreement, which is Article 184, under which it agreed to use good faith and best endeavours to achieve a sovereignty compliance arrangement by year end. So far, it's not been fulfilling that obligation by demanding overrides of UK sovereignty, for instance, for fishing and level playing fields, not discussing the replacement of the protocol with sovereignty compliant solutions, and not negotiating in accordance with the agreement generally in good faith. Those are very real obligations under international law. And under international law, if one party doesn't fulfill a basic obligation to the other, then the other is entitled to suspend and then terminate the entire arrangement. The UK would have to do that in addition, most likely through an act of parliament, to buttress the point, although initially potentially it could be achieved without act of parliament. In parallel, though, it's important, as I think everyone does want to deal, to make clear that the UK is standing behind its offer, as agreed in the political declaration for a sovereignty compliant future relationship, and that there would, it would be quite damaging to the EU not to go ahead with that arrangement, not least because the legal structure of the Eurozone is extremely volatile, fissile, and the UK effectively helps manage Eurozone risk at the moment, and that the EU really should have a services and overall trade relationship with the UK, so that the UK can address the dumping and subsidisation and financial risk that's been thrown off from the Eurozone structure in its current half-built state for the next 20, 30 or so years, while the EU decides whether to integrate and remove those effects. The all-island economy, which with Northern Ireland Protocol sought to create, is not actually in the interest of the EU any more than the UK, because it creates ongoing friction. And as the UK becomes more competitive and outcompetes the EU, it's likely to pull Ireland itself out of the EU. Plus, there are sort of democratic aspects of the agreement. Although there's a 4-year regular checkup on the Northern Irish being comfortable with the laws that they're subject to, it's highly questionable whether it's actually even possible to subject people to laws that they can only do something about every 4 years. They're not made by Northern Ireland or UK lawmakers. So I think there is a way forward on all of these points. We'll have to see now how the government proceeds on the sort of deal on offer. But I think the main point to note is that this is unfinished business. It would not be sufficient just to enter into a Canada style or Canada plus ideally style deal with the EU without resolving these problems and wrapping up this system into an overall architecture that works. Otherwise, it won't be a full Canada deal because all of these points will remain and cut into that, particularly the state aid points. Nor, in fact, would it be possible to walk away and just end up with an Australia type style deal without dealing with these points. Because under the Australia terms, which are basically WTO terms, are not subject to these sovereignty encroachments either. So this is really the elephant in the room, which needs resolving as part of everything that we're about to see being unveiled. And I very much hope these points are addressed.
Thank you very much indeed, Barney, for that analysis. Well, ladies and gentlemen, our next contributor is Professor Patrick Minford of the Cardiff Business School. Patrick's been a staunch advocate of free market economics for many years. He promoted Thatcherite economics before Thatcher. Most importantly, Patrick has consistently argued that Britain would be better off out of the European Union, and he's produced a number of editions of his book, Should Britain Leave the European Union? An Economic Analysis of a Troubled Relationship. Patrick is also chairman of Economists for Free Trade. He supports the government strategy of seeking a free trade agreement with the EU, but in the absence of such an agreement, he maintains that the UK will achieve strong economic growth in the medium term, trading under WTO rules. Ladies and gentlemen, Patrick Minford.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Barry, for those kind words of introduction. Thanks to Barney for his very lucid exposition of where we are on the discussions about a newer relationship. So let me now share my screen, if I may, and talk about some issues that Barney hasn't dealt with that Barry asked me to deal with. So my brief remarks are about what next, and they fall into really three issues. Where are we on Brexit? What's the outlook given all the coronavirus discussion? And what about the prospects for the public finances, and what should monetary and fiscal policy do? So let me start with Brexit. I've just got a few brief points about it. As Barry mentioned, I've done quite a lot of modeling of the gains from Brexit, and they include moving towards free trade, which is something that's very important for the UK and was a traditional policy, which we're hopefully going back to, running our own regulation and controlling immigration. And between those three, and of course the budget, stopping paying into the EU budget. So between all those four things, our model suggests that there's a gain of about 7% of GDP in the long run from going ahead with this Brexit program. And that's been opposed by Remainers, who continue to argue the case for a Brexit in name only, as we're all familiar. And they've done it on the basis that the EU-UK trade barriers that will come up under any sort of proper Brexit, as it were, will do much more damage than the gains from these elements. And that analysis is entirely wrong, in my opinion, because they use the wrong model. They use this so-called gravity model where the only trade that really matters is the trade with your neighbors, effectively, and the trade with people who are distant is of no consequence. And of course, this is completely wrong in the case of the UK. As we've shown statistically, it doesn't fit the UK trade facts. And also, it doesn't fit the common sense test of what we think UK trade is about, which is, of course, trade all over the world, especially in our services and the city, which, of course, the distance doesn't matter at all. So they've used this model to beat us all over the head. And of course, the Treasury have taken it up because the Treasury has always opposed Brexit and continues to make these arguments, which is rather embarrassing, I think, for the government, that their principal ministry still disagrees with their policy. But that's by the by. As Barry mentioned, if we do go to a WTO rules exit for the various reasons that Barney's talked about, where we can't negotiate a proper agreement in the terms he's described, then it turns out that this is perfectly okay for us. The first thing to understand is that non-tariff barriers under WTO rules are actually illegal. So a lot of discussion of that falls away, really. What there will be under WTO rules is tariffs, most favored nation tariffs that we have to impose on everybody. And therefore, if we're going to do trade deals in which we abandon these tariffs to those that we do deals with, we'll have to put them on those we don't do deals with, which will, of course, include the EU. But these tariffs, it turns out, will cost the EU and not the UK, because what will be the case is that when we go to free trade, prices in the UK, under which all our exporters, importers, and producers will operate, will be world prices. And so EU exporters who sell to us will have to meet those prices because that's the competition. And therefore, they'll have to absorb any tariffs we put on them. And when we export to the EU, whatever tariffs they put on won't affect the prices we charge, and therefore will be paid by their own consumers. So this point is that if we do this WTO rules deal, it just contributes tariff revenue to us on top of the gains from free trade. And that actually, if we looked at it quite strictly, is better for us than doing a deal, oddly enough. But it's certainly costly to the EU. And the conclusion really is that no deal is really bad for the EU. And of course, that's beginning to become apparent from the comments we're hearing from countries like Belgium and Ireland. And indeed, French agriculture and German manufacturing, they all sell masses to us. And for them, no deal will mean that they'll face tariffs, which are expensive for them. And on the other hand, we're actually better off with no deal. But as Barney said, we all want a deal because we want to be good neighbors. So I think there will be a deal because it's bad for the EU not to get a deal fundamentally, particularly in particular countries that it'll be extremely bad, like Ireland and parts of the French economy, like particularly agriculture, and parts of the German economy, particularly cars, of course. So I think whatever you want to call the deal we'll get, and I completely agree with what Barney said, it needs to satisfy all those points he made. You can call it what you like, Canada Plus that's kind of satisfies the points, or I think such a deal is likely. So that is a quick summary of where I think we are on Brexit. Now, moving on to forecasting. I mean, the awful thing today is that if you do forecasting, as I do with my little group, you have to have a view about this whole virus issue because it's constantly intruding into the forecast, of course, and the recovery from it is absolutely crucial to seeing how the forecast is going to turn out. So how bad is this second wave that's now going on? I think the most important point about it is to notice that it really isn't like the first wave. We've looked at the 28 countries where there are second waves, And it turns out that the death rate, which is a kind of good proxy for all the nastiest consequences of the wave, is well down, as I'll show you a slide in a moment. And that's true also in the UK. Well, I'll show a couple of slides on that in a moment too, where actually total UK deaths, you wouldn't believe it from some of the headlines in the newspapers, actually completely normal at the moment. It turns out that COVID deaths are slightly above normal and other deaths are slightly below normal, but excess deaths, as they're called, are basically zero at the moment in the UK. I mean, of course, that may change. We don't know exactly what's going to happen, but the trend is very clear. So why is it that the second wave is so different in its behavior, really, from the first? And first of all, everywhere there's much more testing, which has raised the number of cases that have been identified, of course, and those are the ones we see in the statistics. Probably there's more immunity, and we know there's better treatment. And another point that comes out of all this is that the lockdown seemed to have been an overreaction, because if we look at countries that haven't had lockdowns, but have done much more social measures and advice and so forth, like Sweden, they've had pretty much the same experience as we had with our lockdowns. And of course, it's turned out to be much less economically damaging. So it looks like all these lockdowns are really quite an overreaction. And as many of you will know, three leading epidemiologists led an enormous declaration signed by a lot of other doctors around the world and medical scientists, the Great Barrington Declaration, saying that the strategy should be really not to lock down the economy, but to shield the vulnerable. And that is eminently feasible. I know a lot of people have cast doubt on it. There's another competing declaration which says this is all very irresponsible. But I have to say that in terms of, economic policy, it's really important that we shield the economy and we shield the vulnerable, rather than doing what we're doing at the moment, which is quite damaging to the economy in the second wave. So let's have a look at a few things that support that. Here's this slide of the 28 countries with the second wave. And here on the left, you can see the first wave. These are deaths over cases. In the first wave, you can see how they went up to very high levels, about 40% at the peak here, and then came down as the wave kind of crested and fell off. And here's the second wave, you see, down at about just a bit between 1% and 2%. So very different. And then if you look at the UK, there's the first wave, you see. These are cases peaking in the first wave, coming down. And now you can see the second wave, which looks absolutely terrible and huge numbers of cases. Of course, you look at the death rate, and it's hardly moving. These are weekly numbers. And so if you kind of put the ratio of those two things and you look at the deaths from this nasty virus relative to the cases 21 days before, you can see that the thing has come down enormously. And that really is an important factor, which has hardly been drawn attention to by the scientists who are kind of pushing us into lockdown. They kind of just say, oh, it's going to be the same as before. It's going to go, the deaths are going to spiral up because the cases are spiraling up. But they're leaving this important factor out of the discussion. And here, hospitalization, which is, of course, people do go to hospital when they're tested positive quite often, but you can see that even that is going down quite sharply. And of course, they're much more successful now at treating them when they are in hospital. So the rate of hospitalization of cases is going down. So I think that as these facts sort of sink in and people get less nervous about the whole thing, I think we're going to see less of this lockdown and more of this allowing of the economy to recover. So let me now turn to what's going on in the recovery. And of course, the key point about this post-virus situation is that it is lockdowns really mainly that have caused the recession. It's the, and because we weren't very good at doing it. I mean, if you compare the way that the Chinese government did their lockdown and then lifted it with enormous precision, it's a very different kettle of fish what we've done in the UK and in many other countries where it's been a bit of a mess, really. And so it's really been the government and its failure to do these things very well, including the coming out of the lockdown with testing and tracing and so forth, that's caused the recession. And so this makes it a very different recession from the normal recession, because if the government causes this stuff, it can uncause it by taking it off and moving to different policies, which I would argue it should now do. And as we've seen, the virus retreated in the first wave quite steadily and to more or less zero. And this second wave is less lethal, and so justifies new policies. And hopefully, as I've said, as this sinks in, we'll get these lockdowns being eased and taken off. So what has been the shape of the recovery in spite of it all? Now, taking February GDP as 100 here, take a look at the numbers that have transpired. March, down 7%, basically. April, of course, down on the previous month by 20% to 75. So this was when it really hit, the lockdown really hit. And then May, up a little bit as the lockdown started to be eased. June, up quite a lot more, nearly 9%. July, another 7%. August actually up a rather slower 2%. And I would say for September, maybe 3%. So it looks like, on the basis of the latest numbers, that the economy is probably at the end of September about 7% down on the pre-COVID situation. And that means that if the economy continues to recover at about 2% for the rest of the year, we should get back to pretty much where we were pre-COVID by the end of the year. That would be the maths. Now, looking at what's happening in the rest of the world, it turns out that the G4, the four biggest economies in the world, are pretty much back to 2% growth over a year earlier. And if you look at the global PMI for the whole world, based on the market and JP Morgan index, it looks like the world's about 3% up on a year ago. Of course, that includes China, which is about 4 or 5% up on a year ago, has made a big recovery. So that's where we are, really. And if you look at the latest composite the purchasing managers' indices here, you can see that they're all still over 50, even though they're not as strong as they were in September, which is when things were or August, when things were picking up fast here. But they're still above 50, which is they're still recovering. And construction is extremely strong, at 57 in September. So the housing market is quite strong, and so is construction. So, you know, it does look a bit like a V-shaped recovery. Let me show you a few of the charts, if I can get this thing to move. Here we are. Here's the UK chart up to July, and you can see, well, it is a V up to July, and then it's sort of slowing down a bit. But as I say, this V, according to the way I've just described it, should get to pre-COVID by the end of the year. So it'll sort of flatten off a bit, I think, here, and then get to where we were by the end of the year. And here are the global ones. Here's the global JP Morgan market one, which, if you take the PMI, which is this thin line, you can see that this is the growth rate year on year that it implies, essentially. And you can see it's up to 3% on a year earlier. And there you can see that actually, if you look at the PMI orders, order books and jobs, they're all quite strongly recovering too. And although people are very worried, of course, about employment, the thing to remember is employment's a lagging indicator, and basically it responds to GDP much more than it affects GDP. There is feedback, of course, but as long as GDP is recovering fast, employment will recover too. So moving on, let me move now to the issue of the finances and money. So I can get this thing to work. I don't know why it won't work momentarily. Here we are. The first thing that we discovered from this crisis that we knew anyway was that there's an enormous capacity of public debt backed by monetary sovereignty to finance crises like this. And that's what's happened, of course. It's a bit like what happens in a war, really. You can print money, you can borrow quite easily in those circumstances. And the other thing that we've kind of in a way been lucky with, though it was bad for the world economy, we had very low interest rates coming out of the financial crisis, so that interest rates during this crisis have been extremely low, and actually 0.4% or less, in fact. Now they're even less, they're more like 0.2% on very long maturities, which has made it quite favorable environment for government to borrow in. I mean, it's not something I particularly approve of, but it's what it's inherited in this crisis. And, you know, therefore, it's what it can take advantage of. And the implications of that are that really, it makes a lot of sense for the government to issue perpetuities, to make the debt as long as possible. It has increased the maturity. It's now moved from average of 16 years to 20 years, but it really needs to get a lot longer in order to lock in these very low interest rates for the sake of the taxpayer. And what that means is if you issue a perpetuity, you're only paying interest on the coupon, and then you're going to take advantage of that low interest coupon and lock it in indefinitely. Of course, if you pay back, then you'll have to pay back and reissue your debt at whatever interest rate, which may be a lot higher, will be prevailing in the future. But if you lock in these interest rates on perpetuity basis, you never have to redeem them, and so you're in much better shape. You've locked in these very low rates, and that's really important. Now, the only kind of problem in all this is the bank is now buying a lot of this new debt, so it's still staying in the public sector because, of course, the bank is owned by the government, Her Majesty, so it doesn't really get it out of the public sector, and so if it stays in the public sector, then it's not really government debt. And really, it's important, and I think Mr. Bailey, the bank governor, has appreciated this, that they should offload this debt into the private market soon to protect the taxpayer who's got to fund the public sector. So then you get into the point that even if they offload quite a lot of this debt and therefore retire, because when they offload it, they will get money, they'll retire money from the system, so they'll reduce the money supply. But then we get into the problem of once we're into 2021, when we should be seeing quite good recovery, we'll have this very big overhang of money supply growth. And if that hasn't been retired by this strategy that I think the bank should pursue now of offloading the debt it holds and retiring the money it's printed, we'll get a big inflationary threat. And I know Tim will talk about that, so I won't say any more about that, but I think this is an important point. And it means that we really do need to get this debt back into the private market, to get the money supply growth down. And going into 2021, we'll need to tighten money and raise interest rates. In all the various ways, we'll need to tighten money, we'll need to raise interest rates and claw back any money that's still overhanging from all these policies. And in the process, get interest rates up to a normal level, which will restore the savings market and get rid of this so-called zero lower bound, and get monetary policy back to a normal state. So that's the policy agenda I see going into 2021. And finally, let me talk about the question of fiscal policy and deficits and taxes. Now the first point is that this interest that will overhang from the policies of crisis policies that are now being followed, because interest rates are so low, the taxpayer costs are actually very small. It turns out that if interest rates are sort of 0.4% or less, that you only need about 1 pence on the income tax to pay this interest rate, this interest indefinitely. So if you can lock that interest in, as I've discussed, then you really don't face much problem from the fiscal side in paying for it. That's an important point, because I think it has generally been absorbed by people that at these very low interest rates, the cost of the taxpayer is very low. That's the first important point. The second important point is that really, until economic growth post-Brexit, and this is a big transition for us, it's really important that in this period when we go into Brexit, we do these free trade agreements, and we've got these new relationships all around the place, that we support the economy in this transition. And so it's really important we don't raise taxes at this point. And in order to avoid the sort of pettifogging rules that we've kept on encountering from the Office of Budget Responsibility and its sort of fan club in the Institute of Fiscal Studies, we really need to get away from these pettifogging short-run deficit target rules that have nothing to do with long-term solvency, and do fiscal policy on the basis of what is satisfactory in terms of long-term solvency. We need to look at the balance sheet and how that's going to pan out as a result of the policies, and not be obsessed by little short-term rules that stop the government being imaginative about supporting economic growth and force it into sort of poorly judged tax rises in order to kind of, in a McCorberite way, balance the budget today. This is nonsense. And the last point I'd make is that because we can take a long-term view, we haven't got the EU to worry about saying that we're violating their rules, whatever these might be. And we need to keep an eye internally in the UK and the Treasury on these long-term solvency points, that because there isn't a long-term solvency issue, given that the cost of this crisis is really quite small due to the good luck, in a way, of having very low interest rates. It's possible, in fact, for the government to look at the long term and safely finance an ambitious program, that it would like to do, of infrastructure in the north, tax reform, supply side tax cuts to get entrepreneurs going and innovation going. All that is actually possible and should be done. So what I'd just like to end on saying is that we need to look at a long-term plan for fiscal policy and not be obsessed with little short-term rules of thumb about deficit targets. And that's all entirely possible in the present situation. It's really important, though, for the prospects of the post-Brexit era going as we look ahead. Thank you.
Has anyone got questions that they would like to put on the speakers that we have had so far? Can the speakers hear me? Patrick,
yes,
yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, let me
take questions, of course.
Yeah, let me begin with a question then about the trade deals that the government is so anxious to pursue. Now, the Department of International Trade believes that their assessment of the much trumpeted Japanese partnership would boost British GDP by just 0.07%. There's a lot of talk from the government about signing international trade deals, but isn't the reality that they really don't have that much impact on the economy as a whole, and that we need to get our own domestic economic policies working effectively to generate the most growth.
Well, let me deal with that. The truth is that the way in which the department has been assessing these trade deals is, I don't think, the right way. In the models we use, the key thing that trade deals do is to drive down the prices of your imports by getting rid of tariffs on your trade partners, which is good for the consumer and also good for productivity, because it drives up competition in the economy and forces domestic producers to be more productive. And that's where you get the gains from trade deals. On top of that, there's a sort of little icing on the cake, which is that you get access to other countries' markets more easily, in this case in Japan. This seems to be what they've costed in the Department of International Trade. They seem to have costed, the fact that we'll sell a bit more cheese and one thing and another to the Japanese. That is quite small potatoes, really, relative to the gains you get from the Japanese selling you things that they produce well on world markets at world prices without a tariff, bringing down the cost of the consumer. And in the case of Japan, I haven't actually looked at the details of the Japanese deal, but I think they, under this aspect of the effect on our import prices and our consumer prices, is understating, is left out, I think, in these calculations. And when they're added, if they were added, the gains from this Japanese trade deal will be bigger, I think. I haven't, as I say, looked at the Japanese trade deal, but if you look at other trade deals, the gains we're going to make are getting rid of the protection on our agriculture and our manufacturing that the EU has bequeathed to us from its tariffs. And when we get rid of those tariffs on countries like Australia, New Zealand, the US, we'll get an enormous gain from the fact that the consumer prices will come down and our economy will become more competitive. It's kind of that, a lot of this discussion about the gains from trade deals is completely wrongly focused on, these rather trivial gains we get from exporting a bit more to these markets, and not nearly enough focused on the dynamic gains to our own economy, because I completely agree, it's our own economy we want to make more dynamic. And I think I see these trade deals as being one of the supply side weapons for getting our economy to be more dynamic. And then we use the other aspects of regulation, getting rid of regulations that stop innovation, improving our rate of innovation, and making the economy more dynamic in other ways. And of course, also cutting taxes.
Perhaps I can come in the meantime on the,
sure.
the trade deal front. I think we need to get more ambitious on services deals as well, because I think they could, if properly couched, be very beneficial to the economy. And that includes not just financial services, but legal and other service sectors. The sort of received wisdom in many quarters appears to be that you can't get very much on services, and you can't get very much at all on financial services. You can help the regulators to cooperate together, but with each other, but you can't easily liberalize things. And I just think that's erroneous. And in fact, the EU's equivalence regimes, which we basically produced or had a very large hand in producing whilst in the EU, are proof of that, which is that for financial services, and in fact services in general, the key is recognizing each other's standards, so as to allow people to sell to businesses in the first instance, and then consumers, financial services cross-border. The only restrictions really are ensuring that that doesn't create systemic risk in the receiving market, which there are tried and tested ways already of doing, not least under the equivalence architecture I've mentioned, but there are other points at play there as well, which the UK is very well able to navigate. And consumer protection, which does need to remain localized, and it did in fact effectively remain localized under the EU passport regime. But we need to find ways of navigating that as well, because as everything goes online, and COVID has accelerated that, really we need to move quickly to even more quickly to a world where we can provide services, financial services in particular, cross-border to people through their iPhones and Samsung's Galaxies and other types of device, wherever they may be located in the world. And the old-fashioned concepts requiring you to set up an organization on the ground and capitalize it and so on just aren't necessary. And we should be leaders in that. And I think we can get that in the EU trade deal if we play our cards right, and it particularly use the leverage that arises, not of our making, but because the EU architecture around the Eurozone that it's chosen is so dangerous. Really, they need a trade deal and financial services with the UK to keep the show on the road. And we should use the same technology with the US and others. And I think this is something we now need to get the dialogue turning to, not just looking at tariffs, which is now only 20% of the economy and dwindling.
Thank you very much, Barney. I think hopefully we have now got the link to Tim. Tim, can you make your contribution? It doesn't look as if he's picking up on this at all, Robert. Okay, we're going to get another telephone call to Tim to try and sort out the sound link here. Okay, I've got a question here from Gillian. It's quite a simple question for our two panelists, and that is, can we revoke the withdrawal agreement if we so wish? Barney.
Essentially, yes. I mean, well, domestically, Parliament hasn't bound itself, because as a matter of UK law, Parliament, as you can see through the Internal Market Bill, can do what it wants. Obviously, that's subject to Parliament deciding to do that, and that's not subject to ongoing debate. On the international plane, as I mentioned earlier, a fundamental breach of contract effectively by the EU, and the contract being the withdrawal agreement, in not ending up at year end with an agreement that recognises UK sovereignty in its internal market, and using good faith to do so and best endeavours, would, in my view, constitute grounds for denunciation, and that would include the dispute resolution provisions in the withdrawal agreement. So the whole thing, because self-evidently, if there has been such a fundamental breach, you don't go through dispute resolutions provisions that refer themselves to the ECJ and EU law. It would be an absurdity. So I think that is possible. And also the other reason for saying that is that Article 50, which is the power that the EU used for itself to sign, for the EU 27 to sign up to the withdrawal agreement, only gives power to the EU to agree on a withdrawal arrangement against a framework for the future relationship, that relationship being the framework being set out in the political declaration. And it was always highly questionable under the Theresa May administration whether really you could use those powers to construct a longer term arrangement under the Northern Ireland backstop, as it was then called. It was at that time, though, you had both the UK and the EU seeking to nevertheless have a long-term relationship through that backstop. There were people in the UK who thought that was the way forward, and that was a good thing to get. And so that point wouldn't have been taken. But nevertheless, and it's been acknowledged by the EU, that Article 50 does not provide powers for some long-term relationship. And so, I mean, you could debate whether if we don't agree something by year end, there'd be some sort of short-term application of these provisions. But I think, given the fundamental nature of the breach, essentially this document was only signed on the basis that at the end of the year, there is a sovereign to sovereign relationship. The UK has not agreed to give up sovereignty on the way out. It's not a club which you join and then you have to leave your clothes when you walk out of the door. If you ever want to leave the room, I mean, that would be an absurdity, and I think anyone would see that objectively outside the bubble that we operate in.
Thank you very much. Patrick, would you like to comment further on this?
Well, Barney's the lawyer, but I completely take his point that we are, in fact, a sovereign independent country in actual fact. And we can of course, do what we like in terms of international treaties.
Christopher Lim, he says no.
So
he says he's got a question.
So the point really is that what's the consequence? And I think the consequence is that we have in practice, we would in practice leave, and we would trade under WTO rules, which is the main economic relationship we have with the EU. And we would also, of course, do agreements on all the individual aspects that we'd have to do as a sovereign nation with the EU as a group on things like citizen rights, aviation, and so forth. So yes, of course, if this thing breaks down, we'll go the bit that the Remainers have always kind of focused on has been the trade side. But as I said earlier, according to the trade model that fits UK facts, we can trade with the EU on WTO rules perfectly fine. And we get all the gains from Brexit that we would get with a trade agreement, frankly. So I think that we would do these other agreements, as Barney has said, through the normal processes of international law, and we would trade under WTO rules. And it would be perfectly a good outcome.
Just one question that someone sent is, what benefit would there be for the UK to revoke the international law term would be to denounce the withdrawal agreement? The answer is there's nothing in that agreement really that benefits the UK, apart from the 11-month right to negotiate a sovereignty compliant free trade agreement. I mean, every other aspect of it pretty much for Northern Ireland, for citizens and so on. I mean, the citizens the UK will deal with anyway. The monetary payments, the House of Lords subcommittee that looked at this found that they weren't owing, liabilities not owing. Long-term, long-tail liabilities to the EIB and so on, you know, in relation to ventures the UK is no longer a part of, clearly not in the UK's interests. And the way the Northern Ireland Protocol is drafted, which subjects people in Northern Ireland to laws they have no vote over, or representative in the room voting over them, and state aid provisions that give the EU, in its own discretion, dynamic control over the whole of the Northern Ireland economy, but actually the UK economy as well. They're clearly adverse to UK interests. I mean, it was a document drafted by the EU. I don't think it was negotiated really by anyone on the UK side. I don't detect, as a lawyer looking at it, I don't detect any signs of UK lawyering over that document at all. I think it was handed over. There may have been a few discussions of peripheral points, but it's effectively EU drafting. And it was a document that the UK had to sign within the EU construct. At the time, the UK was prohibited by the EU, I think contrary to the provisions of the treaties, from mitigating its position, its potential losses by negotiating trade deals with third parties, the US and so on. We could have negotiated, in my view, in the 2-year negotiating period under the May administration. We chose not to, but EU prohibited us from doing that. So the only thing that we ended up with, which the Johnson government decided to run with, I think it was a sensible thing to give it one last shot and see whether we could end up with a reasonable sovereignty compliant trade deal, was the 11-month runway. And that's what we're living through. And we'll either end up with the sovereignty compliant arrangement at the year end, or we're better off without the withdrawal agreement, negotiating afresh as a proper sovereign after year end. And we're not losing anything, in my view, by starting again.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, I've got another question here from Gillian. She's asking, do the panelists think that there will actually be an agreement with the EU this year? What do they think the chances of reaching an agreement are? And secondly, if we don't reach an agreement by the year end, can we just go to trading under WTO rules and then at a subsequent date negotiate an agreement with the EU? Barney.
I think there's a reasonable chance there'll be a deal for all the reasons Patrick says, which is it's in the EU's interest for there to be one. And I think if you look at evidence of conduct, not what people say, but what they do, the recognition already of some of the equivalence determinations by the EU of the UK infrastructure and so on indicate to me that there is rational behaviour taking place behind this, under the surface. Whether it's admitted to or not is a different matter. And I think the same thing will be evidenced. But if there isn't a deal and we tear up effectively the withdrawal agreement, Northern Ireland Protocol, and start again and go on to WTO terms, obviously we've committed not to impose a hard border on the island of Ireland. On goods, that ends up with the situation Patrick outlined, where the UK does better out of it than the EU. Obviously, it would be preferable to have a deal, but it's not disastrous. On services, there's no difference currently because the EU is not offering a services deal by all accounts in the reports in the press. And so we don't really end up in any different position there either. I mean, the main thing is the disruption to the goods and agri-products business at year end. I would have thought there will be disruption and it would be far preferable to end up with a deal. But I don't think, I think the one thing that Theresa May said that I'd agree with, which is that no deal is better than a bad deal, and we need to look at the text and make sure that it's been properly thought through and it's something that's durable. And it's not in the EU's interest to have an arrangement with the UK that's not durable anyway, in my view.
Thank you. Patrick.
Yes, I completely agree with that. And as Barney mentioned, I think there will be a deal, to answer Gillian's questions, for the reason that the damage to the EU is huge, and we've kind of seen that from comments from Ireland, comments from Belgium, very worried about the Flanders economy, comments from French farmers, comments from Angela Merkel about the need for a deal. It's all quite clear that it is sinking home that there will be enormous damage to the EU. And frankly, from our point of view, as I've said, there's no damage because we'll go to free trade. And under free trade, you don't need a deal really with the EU because they have to sell to us at world prices like everybody else. I mean, and of course, they know that, which is why they would rather we didn't leave the EU, of course, because they can sell to us at inflated prices due to all this protection. So, but as it were, if we actually put tariffs on them as well, in the absence of a deal under WTO rules, they will be even worse hit by Brexit. And so this is a nightmare scenario for an awful lot of EU industries, which people forget that we are a fifth of the EU market. And, people also forget that we don't really care because although the EU market, we sell to it, we sell worldwide. And under the free trade policies we're pursuing, we'll be selling worldwide at world prices, and the prices here will be the same as world prices. So if we swap our exports from the EU to exports elsewhere, we'll get the same prices. There may be some transitional, breaking into markets expenditure required, but in the long run, there's really no difference. And that's the key point, really. So yes, there will be a deal because for the EU, not having a deal will be a complete disaster, coming on top, of course, of the enormous problems that their economies have got already with the huge recession that they're trying to recover from, and also the very iffy banking system they have, which Barney has examined in some detail and has pointed out. So they really are in a weak position on this. And I think the reality has struck home from comments we've been hearing from the negotiating teams.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Now, I've got a question from Alison MacDonald. She says a question for Barney in particular. How do you interpret the apparent UK concession on the ECHR? Is this a harbinger of further unfavourable concessions by the UK?
I'm not quite sure what the concession is from all the reports. This is the European Convention on Human Rights, which has nothing to do with the EU. It sits above the EU, actually, under another international law treaty that the EU itself is the member states parties to. And the EU has its own version of the Convention of Fundamental Rights. I'm not quite sure what we've said we'll do. I think the UK, the UK has been a signatory to the convention, and I would envisage it we remain so. What's controversial in the UK is the Human Rights Act, which has given enforcement powers to the courts, which have been exercised in ways which some people have found unpredictable and undesirable. And there have been controversial instances that I'm sure everyone's aware of. And the question is that the right way to implement? And what I don't know is, I think the EU would like us to carry on having some sort of commitment that to a ECHR. In and of itself, I would have thought that's harmless. Whether it's drafted in a way that brings in the UK courts in the way that they are now is all down to the drafting of that commitment. And I would have thought we shouldn't make that commitment.
Okay, do you want to comment on this one at all, Patrick?
No, it's no, I don't know anything about this. No.
Okay, I've now got a question about the tactics of our negotiating, which says the EU believes that there is enormous pressure on the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson to have a deal because he said he had an oven-ready one. So while it's usually the EU whose priority is never to lose face, is it now the other way around?
Well, this goes back to why we signed up to the withdrawal agreement and Northern Ireland Protocol in the first place at the beginning of this year. And I think Boris Johnson and his government in good faith thought that the documents meant what they said, which is that there would be an 11-month period during which we negotiated for the full final year-end future relationship which respects UK sovereignty and the UK internal market. And that was the belief at the time. And that document, which is what he referred to, the withdrawal agreement and Northern Ireland Protocol, were oven ready in that context. They weren't good agreements, but they effectively brought that 11-month period to end up with something at the end of the term that's satisfactory. And if you wind the clock back to discussions when Theresa May was Prime Minister with the EU insisted on splitting these the three main topics: Northern Ireland, a financial payment, and citizens' rights, from the future relationship and dealing with those three first. The UK at the time, I remember all the reports and statements, made quite clear they thought that was ludicrous and it wasn't possible to do that properly, particularly in the case of Northern Ireland. I think that was true then and remains true now, but nevertheless, we agreed to a bifurcated process where we dealt with those points on the basis of a sort of stepping stone to when they collapsed back together at year end with the final arrangement. And obviously, if that final arrangement doesn't transpire to be on offer, then the whole thing falls away. I don't think that means any red faces anywhere in the UK, on the UK side of things, because if we were to end up in such a situation, it would be clearly not one envisaged by the documents we signed. So when we entered into those documents, we did so on the basis of Article 184, which says this is what we both strive to agree using best faith and good faith and best endeavours at year end. And if that doesn't turn out to, and arguably that frankly, sadly, has already been breached by the EU, but if we don't end up with that, I don't think anyone ends up with a red face. I think it's just a sadness that we haven't been able to agree a future relationship amicably on this timescale. It's pretty unusual. It's sort of, in trade terms, it's rocket science to agree a trade agreement on this and a future relationship on this sort of timetable on the way out of leaving a bigger bloc. If you think of decolonialization efforts or the breakup of the USSR, typically people leave and then under GATT and then subsequently WTO practice, existing trade relations carry on the same terms until the two parties negotiate new arrangements on a sovereign basis from the outside as two equal sovereigns. We're trying to concertina the whole thing and do it on, in one stop, because the EU has insisted that from year end they have to apply MFN rules and WTO law, which is highly questionable actually as a matter of international law in and of itself, because it's not how the WTO or how GATT was set up, the predecessor to WTO in 1947, when all the decolonialization efforts where states had broken away from bigger states, from the UK, France, US, were allowed to, were ones where it was allowed. They were carved out expressly from GATT on the basis that everything continued until new arrangements were put in place. And the UK has flexed the GATT rules, as have other countries, in relation to, and WTO, in relation to Berlin, in relation to the EC being formed itself, and all sorts of other instances. The whole purpose of GATT and now WTO is to lower and remove trade barriers, not to impose them. So we're in an extraordinary situation at the insistence of the EU, where we're trying to do something before year end. Otherwise, they'll want to take this view of GATT and WTO and apply the rules in the way that they propose, which itself, as I say, is contrary to state practice historically. It's not how we treated people. And it's contrary, I mean, it's even arguably contrary to international law, frankly, but we're in this position and that's what we're trying to do. And it is rocket science to pull it off by year end. And I wish them all the luck they have. But I don't think there's anything wrong though with giving up on it if clearly we don't get the side of the bargain that we contracted for.
Thank you very much indeed. Patrick, any comment on this particular point?
I think that Barney's right. There's no red faces here. If there's no agreement, it's because the EU won't agree. We've made it clear that we would like an agreement, and we'll go to WTO rules. And so I don't see there's any problem with that, as I've argued already. And I don't think there would be red faces. I think it would simply be pretty obvious to everybody that we wanted to do a deal. We said we've negotiated in good faith, and the EU has really made it impossible to do it for some reason, which I say would be illogical from their point of view. And the only thing I think that is of a concern to the government is disruption. And just to make a point about that, I mean, it is possible that the French government, for example, would start to go slow at customs, or some other government might start to instruct their customs to go slow and cause problems at the border. But of course, due to WTO rules, that is strictly illegal action, as well as being commercially damaging to the ports involved. So I don't expect to see much of that. And if there is that sort of effort to kind of disrupt by EU governments, then I would expect that there would be legal remedies would put in place pretty fast against governments, against port authorities, and all over the place, because it's strictly illegal under WTO rules. And so that's the only thing I think that could embarrass the government, if there's a lot of disruption and these huge queues build up and so forth that people have talked about. But that would be the result of illegal action, and I mean, the EU is a fairly law-abiding body, and the courts of the EU, the lower courts, and our courts are empowered to deal with these issues, of course. So that's why I think this disruption would be very short-lived if it was even tried on. So I don't think there's any problem really if there's no deal. It may well be there'll be no deal, and if so, we'll just have to do as Barney says. We'll become a sovereign country, and we'll have to negotiate in the future.
Okay, well, ladies and gentlemen, we're coming towards the end of our allotted time, and I would like to thank Barney and Patrick for the immense expertise that they have shown today, and the way in which they have dealt so effectively and so knowledgeably with all the varied questions that have been put to them. But again, can I thank our speakers and all of you, ladies and gentlemen, for tuning in and putting such effective questions forward. Thank you.